aurochs still survives there, but the aurochs disappeared by 1627. In 55 BC, the Romans found brown bears in Britain and exported them to fight in the circuses of Rome. They also found wolves, beavers and wild boars. Red deer and roe deer were plentiful. Wild cats still existed in southern England, and martens inhabited the great forests which still covered most of the island. However, there were no rats and no rabbits. Possibly the bear was the first species to be exterminated deliberately by man, for it was, of course, a great menace to herdsmen and shepherds. On an island, a species cannot be replenished easily from other territory, and by the 10th century the bear was extinct. The beaver possibly survived into the 12th century. There are records of it occurring at Cardiganshire until then. It probably survived even longer in Scotland. Wolves were always regarded as man's enemies, and in Saxon times large bounties were paid for killing them. However, in spite of this, they survived in Scotland and Ireland until well into the 18th century, although in very small numbers. The last English wolf is believed to have been killed at the beginning of the 16th century. So here we have the brown bear at the top, the wolf in the centre, and the beaver down below. The age of hunting. It was after the Roman period that man began to interfere seriously with Britain's mammal population. Until then, the decline of prosperity of a species had been due either to variations in climate or to alteration of habitat. However, as farming developed and as weapons of destruction such as the longbow and crossbow became more efficient, the effects of man's actions on other species became more marked. During Saxon times, an enormous amount of hunting took place, but after the Norman conquest in 1066, it was very rigidly controlled. Poaching of deer was punishable by death, and thus the first deliberate act of conservation took place. However, mammals other than deer and wild boar were not protected, and anything which could be eaten or which offered any sort of threat to farming or stock raising was killed. Thus, the wild cat and the marten, as well as the wolf, were greatly reduced in numbers. James I hunted the wild boar, which may have survived at least in northern England into the 18th century. Wild cattle also survived, though these were not the true aurochs, the giant wild cattle of Europe, but a smaller breed which was still to be found in very small numbers in the Welsh mountains as late as the 17th century. In the 12th century, herds of them were rounded up and enclosed in various parks in northern England. man's power to dominate other species was almost unlimited. The first mammals to suffer from these developments were the predators. Any mammal or bird which could kill other game, poultry or farm stock was ruthlessly destroyed. Thus, the wolf disappeared and the wildcat was driven to the most inaccessible habitats. In the 19th century, the preservation of game birds for private shooting increased considerably. Gamekeepers were employed to destroy the predators, and the population of badgers, polecats, stoats and weasels therefore declined. Today the badger has made a good recovery, as it is no longer persecuted to the same drastic extent, but the polecat is a rare animal and exists only where it is tolerated. The otter survived rather well until the present day, although haunted by hounds and disliked by many fishermen. It declined when its habitat, the rivers and streams, became polluted, or building and industrial development altered part of its territory. Now, in some danger, the otter would probably recover if rivers were cleaned up and if it could be given some protection. And here we have some otters on that page. Foxes. The predator which has survived most successfully into modern times is the fox. In Roman times and until the 18th century, foxes had to compete for their food with wolves and wild cats. The supply of food was limited, as farm stock, such as lambs and poultry, was not as numerous as today, and the rabbit, introduced in the 13th century, did not become a common animal until the 18th century. When the wolves and wild cats disappeared and rabbits became more numerous, the fox population grew rapidly. Fox hunting became an organised sport in the 18th century. Because it was a sport, a form of recreation for country people, foxes were preserved to a certain extent. By the 19th century, fox hunting had become even more popular, and the fox's habitat or covert was also protected. Consequently, copses, woodland and gorse patches were not cleared for farming, and these also provided a habitat for a great variety of birds and mammals. However, in some areas where foxes became a nuisance to farming, or where hunts did not operate, they were kept in check by trapping and shooting. To a certain extent, this situation still exists. Today, foxes flourish and perform their essential function as natural predators in those areas where they are preserved and controlled by hunts. Elsewhere, they are being much more ruthlessly destroyed by shooting, gassing, poisoning and trapping, to such an extent that, were it not for hunting, the fox and the habitat preserved because of him would perhaps disappear. Already in some parts of the country he is leaving the countryside and becoming a suburban animal. Just to say, just as an aside to this was written a long time ago, and it's actually illegal to fox hunt in this country now. Seals. Predators perform a vitally useful part in regulating the animal populations upon which they prey and in destroying sick or injured animals and surplus young. The relationship between prey and predator is a very delicate one, never perfect and always changing. Under ideal conditions it works very well. It works badly only when some factor, such as man's interference, is thoughtlessly introduced. For instance, if all predators in a wood, both mammals and birds, are destroyed in order to protect game birds, the effect is highly undesirable. causes damage to cereal and root crops, woodlands and plantations. In some areas, such as Exmoor, red deer are hunted with hounds, but in Scotland they are usually shot by stalkers. This is a much better and more humane method of control than hunting, and providing it is carried out by experts using the right type of weapon, should be perfectly acceptable to conservationists. Again, just remember this is an old book, so I don't know whether any of this applies to the modern day. Okay, top we have red deer, middle fallow deer, below roe deer. So hind and stag, buck and roe, buck and doe, and buck and doe. Some small mammals. The decline in animal populations is not always brought about directly by the activities of man. To a greater or lesser extent, of course, all mammals are affected by changes in their environment due to its destruction or pollution by man, but other and more ancient causes still persist. Various mammals, such as voles, are affected by periodic population explosions or declines, probably due to weather factors and the degree to which food is available. Red squirrels have always been subject to periodic fluctuations, about every 7 years, and their present scarcity is probably as much due to this as the destruction of their woodland habitats. The introduction and spread of the grey squirrel, often blamed for the decline of the red squirrel, has probably meant that the latter cannot recover its numbers in areas where the grey squirrel is present, but there is little evidence that the grey squirrel actually drives the red squirrel out. In medieval times, red squirrels were treated as vermin, as they were supposed to deprive the deer of food. Climate change has always been another cause of declines. It is believed that the modern scarcity of the once fairly common dormouse is due to the fact that our winters are becoming warmer. This causes the dormouse to wake from hibernation in midwinter and to perish from exposure or starvation. Dormice are also extensively preyed upon by foxes and crows while hibernating. Harvest mice are declining in Britain almost certainly due to changes in farming methods and the destruction of hedgerows. Crop spraying with pesticides also affects them as they eat both grain and insects. So we've got the red squirrel and we have the dormouse. snakes and toads, it is now increasing in those areas where it is unmolested. Here is the pine marten. Here is the polecat. Mammal pests. Some mammals in Britain have increased in numbers to the point where they have become pests. This has usually happened because no suitable predator exists in sufficient numbers to control them, and because they are naturally successful and adaptable animals. On the whole, man has not been very good at controlling them, and their increase is detrimental to other species as well as to man himself. The principal mammal pests in Britain are the brown rat, the rabbit, the grey squirrel, the house mouse, and the black rat. Between them, they do an enormous amount of damage every year, costing many millions of pounds. It is noteworthy that each one of them has been introduced into this country from abroad, either accidentally or deliberately. The black rat was introduced to this country in the Middle Ages, probably in ships returning from the Crusades. It increased in number and spread rapidly, carrying with it the fleas which harbour the virus of bubonic plague. It has been largely replaced by the brown rat, which arrived also by ship in the 18th century, carrying with it the food poisoning organisms known as salmonella. It would be good conservation, beneficial to all other wildlife, to exterminate both species completely. Wow, that's a large statement. Before 1953, when 90% of rabbits were destroyed by disease, myxomatosis, they had caused damage to crops totalling about £50 million a year. Originally introduced by the Normans, rabbits provided food and fur for many centuries, and only became pests when the controlling predators were reduced. This attractive animal is a useful source of food to predators, but humane control is absolutely essential, although complete extermination might be undesirable. A rabbit, a brown rat. Birds in the past. Just as there was a wide variety of mammals in Britain at the time of the Roman occupation, there must also have been many birds which no longer breed here. Records from Roman and Saxon times mention birds which today are no more than rare vagrants to Britain. At least one, the great auk, is now extinct. Others probably breeding here at that time, including the crane, griffon vulture, spoonbill, eagle owl, Dalmatian pelican, and Jaya falcon. Climatic changes over the succeeding centuries may have accounted for the loss of some of these birds, but other expensive.